Yesterday, the newest indie animated pilot titled Catching Up was released. This pilot was created by LS Mark, another YouTube reviewer and critic, which makes it especially interesting. Unfortunately, after watching, I personally don't think the pilot lived up to the expectations that myself and some people had for it, which I'll get into in this video. Before I can get into my proper thoughts, I'll give a brief synopsis of what happens for those who haven't watched it or anyone looking for a recap. Catching Up pilot tells the story of two high school characters, being a wolf called Clay and his mouse friend Rob. We start things off in school and get to see the characters' personalities. Clay is a bit jaded and unenthusiastic, while Rob is happy-go-lucky and hyper. Clay is coaxed to attend a club with Rob by his mother, and the club is actually a community centre. While on the bus, Rob gladly becomes a coat rack for two ladies. Once inside the club, we see the crazy atmosphere and loud music. Rob struggles to buy drinks since he's out of money and gets into a scuffle involving one of the coats. Elsewhere, Clay struggles to fit in, feeling embarrassed and messing up two conversations with girls. Clay is offered some alcohol by another character and becomes drunk. Later outside the club, Rob confronts the two girls that forced him to carry their coats around all day. They get into an argument, Clay comes in to support his friend, and the two of them slam the coats on the water-covered pavement, annoying the girls. The two walk off and the pilot ends. With the plot summarised, let's get into it. The first issue I have, which stuck with me throughout the pilot, was the pacing. The pacing is extremely slow, to the detriment of the flow of the episode. Added to this, characters talk slowly and have long dramatic pauses. All of this combined together means that the pilot drags a bit, and instead of being 20 minutes long, it feels far longer. Linked in with this is the lack of any real goals or premise. In other indie pilots, they've always sort of introduced the characters in a way where you can quickly see their motivations or why they act the way they do. The point of a pilot is to introduce the world and cast, but I feel like we don't really get that here. Clay and Rob are the two main characters, but we don't really get an introduction to them. We don't find out how they met, why they're in this wacky world of anthropomorphic characters, or why they act the way they do. Their two personalities seem to clash, only really working together at the very end when Clay is drunk. I think the pilot would have benefited a lot from a setup or flashback to introduce the duo. This would set up the premise of the show, but also allow us to get more attached to the characters, since we will understand their motivations. The writing of the episode just overall felt a bit underwhelming and linear. The comedy wasn't particularly noteworthy, with the one joke I laughed at being the joke Clay made when trying to chat up a girl in the club. It's pretty clear that the bulk of the humour is meant to come from the awkward silences or cringe moments, but I don't think these were strong enough to carry the pilot. The plot was incredibly simple, with the pair just going to a club and that's it. There wasn't much payoff other than the realization that clubs can be cringe and awkward. The tone is a bit confusing. I don't think Catching Up knows its target audience. It feels as if the show is aiming for a teenager or young adult demographic, but with a couple of swears and overall concept, I don't think it really appeals to either. I think the show probably would have been better if it focused on appealing to younger viewers, rather than the situation it's in now, where it's in between the two and feels unfocused. Similarly, the character designs are a bit hit or miss. Clay and Rob's designs just appear very flat and basic. This is a bit problematic since they're the two main characters who are on screen most of the time. I didn't feel myself getting drawn to them as much since they weren't particularly interesting. Linked in with the characters are the voices. The voice work was excellent in this pilot. All of the characters are voiced incredibly well and they largely fit their roles. Michael Kovac's performance as Clay was immediately recognisable, though it doesn't feel too dissimilar to Jax from the Digital Circus. Elsewhere, the cast is littered with cameos from recognisable voice actors and creators, a few notable ones being the Newgrounds veterans like Josh Tomar, Chris O'Neill, Zach Hadel and Senior Pello. This is a bit of a downside though, since any time this pilot is brought up, people are just mentioning all the cameos and not talking about the core show itself. On the topic of designs, the overall animation style is great. It's clearly been inspired by early 2000s cartoons, and this makes a lot of sense considering the content Mark creates. There's a lot of love for the source material and this bleeds into the show's art direction. The animations are all pretty fluid and I love the post-processing effects they've overlaid on top, like the screen slightly shaking in Clay's house, the shadows and light peering through the windows, and the little ladybug floating around. One interesting technique they've done is create two different styles between the background and foreground. The background has this unique style reminiscent of something akin to Cass Vanderpool. There's a couple cute Easter eggs hidden in there as well, like Friar Tuck's or the paper on the club's desk. Whereas the characters themselves have a completely different cartoony style, so they clearly stand out against the backdrop and there's some really good contrast. Background characters are also regularly greyed out as a way to divert our attention away from them, which is a nice touch. These additions mean that the characters never blend into the background. This is an issue with other shows, most notably Has Been Hotel, so it's a breath of fresh air for it to not exist in Catching Up. The overall audio and music of the episode was alright. There are some random sound effects that pop in which are a bit jarring though. They don't particularly enhance the experience and just come off as unneeded. So to summarise, what do I think? Personally, I feel like the pilot can be summed up as a bit underwhelming. I know a lot of people would go into this with a certain level of expectations, seeing that Mark is a full-time critic of animation media, so they'd expect him to recognise issues in other shows and avoid them in his. Unfortunately, however, I don't think it was the case with this one. The show definitely isn't bad and certainly has a lot of charm and potential, but we'll just have to wait and see if that gets realised in future episodes, and whether the project is picked up or if it's crowdfunded. Regardless, it's always great to see a new indie show on the block, and it takes a lot of courage to even attempt to make something of this calibre, which I respect a lot. So what do you think? Do you agree with my takes or have any thoughts of your own? I'd love for you to leave them in the comments section down below. Thanks for watching.